Donald Trump may now have everything that he needs to justify military action against Cuba, at least by his standards. Right, he's strangled the economy but failed to bring down the government. He's received new intelligence that could help him argue that the Cuban military poses a threat to American lives. And the former leader of the country, he is now wanted in the US on charges that could land him a death sentence or life in prison. So actually, well, let's start there, right? Because the Justice Department announced charges against Raúl Castro, the 94-year-old former president of Cuba, accusing him of murder and a conspiracy to kill American citizens. And those charges stem from the fatal downing of 2 planes off the coast of his country more than 30 years ago. And those charges have also been brought against 5 fighter pilots involved in the attack on the planes, which were operated by a group called Brothers to the Rescue that offered assistance to fleeing Cuban refugees. In this case, though, then President Fidel Castro claimed that they had been dropping anti-regime leaflets over the Capitol, and he also took responsibility for the downing. But this indictment said that his brother Raul, who was Minister of Defense at the time, could also be held responsible because, along with Fidel, he served as one of the final decision makers in the Cuban military chain of command. Right, and with that, I'll say exiled Cuban-American lawmakers and activists, as well as survivors of the attack and family members of the victims, they've long called for Raul to be criminally charged. But according to 2 former federal prosecutors familiar with the case, past administrations lack the political will to file charges against such a high-ranking member of an adversarial government. But momentum, it's been building. Right, last year, one of the pilots named in the indictment, he was found to be living in Florida. He was actually first arrested on charges of immigration fraud after he filed for permanent residency but failed to disclose his 30-year-long service in the Cuban Air Force. Also in February, 4 Republican lawmakers asked the Justice Department to indict Castro, writing in a letter, "We believe unequivocally that Raul Castro is responsible for this heinous crime," and saying it is time for him to be brought to justice. But with all that, Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche, who announced the indictment alongside the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Florida, he had little to say when asked why an indictment in this case had been brought right now. And the question you've got most people asking is whether the administration's real motivation is paving the way for a military operation to capture Castro, bring him back to the country to face trial, and pressure the Cuban government into giving in to Trump's demands. Or the same way that an indictment against former Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro served as justification for an attack that notably killed dozens of Venezuelans as well as Cuban soldiers, with Maduro and his wife now awaiting trial in New York. And actually, with this, an American aircraft carrier, the same one that served as a staging ground for the operation to capture Maduro, it has now arrived back in the Caribbean along with multiple warships. Now, you had one official telling the New York Times that the vessel is really only there as a show of force, but who knows? And Blanche, of course, wouldn't say whether the indictment was meant to lay the groundwork for military action, but he did say that a warrant had been issued for his arrest and that he expected Castro to eventually face trial in the United States.
We expect that he will show up here by his own will or by another way.
Right, when Trump was asked yesterday whether he would take military action against Cuba, he replied,
"I don't want to say that."
Though he also said,
"There won't be escalation. I don't think there needs to be. Look, the place is falling apart."
And actually on that last note, he somewhat accurately, though in his Trump exaggerated manner way, laid out how dire the situation is on the island.
It's a failing nation. You see that it's falling apart. They have no oil. They have no money. It's a failing nation. So I just can't tell you that. But we're there to help. We're there to help the families, the people. They have no way of living. They have no food. They have no electricity. They have no energy at all. But they do have great people.
But what Trump also didn't mention there is the role that he has had in creating those conditions. Right? He's effectively imposed a blockade to stop fuel shipments from reaching the country, pushing the country into an energy and humanitarian crisis. Also earlier this week, he signed an executive order sanctioning officials in Cuba's energy, defense, financial, and security sectors, along with 3 government agencies. And all of this here, it also comes along with a decades-long American embargo and other policies that have, at the very least, contributed to poverty, a scarcity of goods, and a lack of economic growth on the island. Though with this, yesterday, which was also the anniversary of the day that the U.S. ended its military occupation of the island in 1902, you had Secretary of State Marco Rubio, a child of Cuban immigrants, delivering a message directly to the Cuban people in Spanish. And he notably denied that the U.S. played any role in the hardships that they have endured.
La verdadera razón por la que no tienen electricidad, combustible ni alimentos es porque quienes controlan su país han saqueado miles de millones de dólares, pero nada ha sido utilizado para ayudar al pueblo.
And he specifically blamed a military-run conglomerate known as Gaesa that's estimated to control between 40% and 70% of the Cuban economy. And to be sure here, many experts agree that this repressive regime's handling of the economy, it's left something to be desired, but many would also reject the idea that the U.S. bears no blame. And so in response, you've seen people like former Obama advisor Ben Rhodes writing on Twitter, Rubio now full Orwellian, the total blockade that we have put on your country after decades of an embargo has nothing to do with the scarcity in your lives or the fact that we are intentionally starving your children. And adding in a follow-up post, also, Rubio works for a guy who has looted far more billions of dollars for himself and his cronies than even the most corrupt Cuban officials. And that's as you also have people saying that the Trump administration is being very hypocritical here, noting that you have the Trump administration indicting Raul Castro for what they argue is defending Cuban airspace, while Trump and Hegseth celebrate the killings of people that have turned out to be innocent fishermen. Right? The Trump administration has killed nearly 200 people in dozens of strikes on boats in international waters, some of whom may have been fishermen, some of whom may have actually been drug dealers, but none of whom had a trial, which is why you have many experts saying that these strikes are in fact straight up murder. And so you actually had the Cuban government making the same argument in a statement, right? And also the country's UN ambassador is among those claiming that the charges against Castro were part of an effort to create a pretext for military action, and actually also suggesting to the New York Times that shooting down the planes had been justified. Right? He claimed brothers to the rescue had violated Cuban airspace 25 times before the Cuban military took action. And with that, saying that Cuban officials had repeatedly pleaded with American authorities to stop the group's flights over Cuba, including with a letter from Fidel Castro to President Bill Clinton. A claim that's apparently supported by declassified US documents from the time. And so you had the ambassador asking, how many deliberate and serious violations of US airspace would any US government allow before taking action? And while he also claimed that Cuba is ready to negotiate with the United States, he said that the government isn't convinced that the Trump administration is acting in good faith, telling the New York Times. Obviously, it does not help a climate of dialogue and trust that every other day there are statements like, we are ready to take over Cuba. Right? At least for right now, it doesn't look like Trump's changing his approach of making maximalist demands. Right? CIA Director John Ratcliffe recently visited Cuba and met with senior officials, including Castro's grandson. And while he reportedly told them that the Trump administration was offering a genuine opportunity for collaboration, he also said that the opportunity was contingent on Cuba severing its ties with Russia, China, and Iran. And that's partly because Russia and China are believed to have high-tech spying facilities on the island. All while you also have Axios recently reporting on US intelligence that Cuba had obtained more than 300 military drones from Russia and Iran since 2023, has stashed them in strategic locations across the island, and is now discussing plans to attack the American military base at Guantanamo Bay if there is a conflict with the US. And so in the meantime, you have both Russia and China pledging their support for Cuba. A spokesperson for the Kremlin saying today that Russia will provide Cuba with active support in the face of increasing US pressure. And you had a Chinese foreign ministry spokesperson saying that the US should stop threatening force at every turn and that his country firmly supports Cuba, and adding, the United States should cease using sanctions and judicial apparatus as tools of coercion against Cuba and refrain from making threats of force at every turn. But yeah, ultimately, all this in addition to the indictment, it is seen as something that could serve as a pretext for military action. And in fact, that's exactly the argument you had Rubio making to reporters today.
Cuba not only has weapons that they've acquired from Russia and China over the years, but they also host Russia and Chinese intelligence presence in their country, not far from where we're standing right now. So Cuba has always posed a national security threat to the United States. They, by the way, have been one of the leading sponsors of terrorism in the entire region. Cuba has consistently posed a threat to the national security of the United States. And the other thing that poses a threat to the national security of the United States is to have a failed state 90 miles from our shores run by friends of our adversaries.
And ultimately, it does seem like the White House is laying the groundwork for a potential attack. And now, whether or not it follows through, that's an open question. But another key thing is that earlier this week, you already had a Politico reporter writing that she's been told by US officials that the administration is growing more open to military action by the day, saying they're frustrated that the pressure campaign hasn't led Cuba's leaders to back down, and saying that military planners are weighing options beyond just a snatch and grab of Castro, including everything from a single airstrike meant to scare the regime to a full-on ground invasion. So kind of just add this to the pile of things that we're gonna have to watch play out. Though I will say there is a playbook that we've seen before, and so far Trump is following it.